I'd like to get directly into the program by introducing very briefly our opening speaker, Neal Rappleye, who will be addressing the topic of Chiasmus criteria and review. He's authorized me to say that he is a researcher for Book of Mormon Central and also, and I'm pleased to add this at his suggestion, that he has, among other things, written for Interpreter, which is a journal that is issued by the foundation that I have the honor to preside over. So I'd invite Neal Rappleye to come forward and make his presentation, and I've promised not to steal the text of his remarks from the podium when I leave.
All right, thank you, Dan. One thing you may have noticed I did not authorize Dan to say is that I am an absolutely brilliant Chiasmus scholar. And the reason I didn't authorize him to say that is because I am not, which I'm sorry if that lets you down given the context of this conference. But I have to confess actually that Chiasmus studies and literary studies in general are not exactly my forte. I have not made any major contribution to the study of Chiasmus or any other literary technique. And although I've read various literary studies of the Bible, Latter-day Saint scripture, and other ancient texts, and have benefited a great deal from the insights made available by people much smarter than I am, I feel a little out of my depth here giving a presentation. But luckily, the task I have been given is not a literary one, but rather a historical one, which is something much more in line with my background as a history major. Specifically, I've been asked to provide a historical review of chiastic studies with emphasis on the effort to develop some form of criteria or standards by which to judge the merits of chiastic proposals. I make no pretensions of being able to resolve the issues that have persisted in the study of chiasmus for the last 75 years, but in reviewing past efforts, I do hope I can adequately identify the problems that persist and provide a fair assessment of where things presently stand. From there, I will leave it to others to try and determine where we need to go and how we move forward. So to begin, chiasmus, let's just get a definition out there for those of you who may be wondering. As a term, it is most commonly used today to describe several types of inverted parallelism, long or short, in which words first appear in one order and then in the opposite order. To use a definition that was given by John W. Welch. In the earliest use of the term chiasmus to describe a literary phenomenon in the Bible appeared in 1742 in the Latin work Nomon Novi Testamenti by D. Johannes Albrecht Bengel. As Bengel used the term, it referred to both alternating parallels, the ABAB variety, called direct chiasmus by Bengel, and inverted parallels, the ABBA variety, called indirect chiasmus. Today, though, like I just mentioned, it's used pretty much exclusively for the inverted parallels, the ABBA variety. It wouldn't be until 1820, when John JEBB published his book Sacred Literature, that inverted parallelism was fully recognized as its own form of parallelism in the Old and New Testaments, although JEBB called it epinodos rather than chiasmus. Although a handful of other 19th century writers also discussed the use of inverted parallels in the Bible, it wasn't until about 200 years after Bengel first used the term chiasmus that a serious study of it in Scripture was made. And that was 1942 with the publication of Neal's WILHELM LUND, his book Chiasmus in the New Testament. And with that came the first attempt to describe the laws governing chiastic structures. Lund identified 7 such laws in total, and Lund's laws had a particular focus on the center of the chiasm. With laws 1 through 4, all dealing in some way with the function of the central elements. While Lund's laws were a pioneering first step, today it is clear they offer little help for the reader trying to identify new examples of chiasmus. So the next major study was Paul Gechter's 1965 monograph, Literary Art in the Gospel of Matthew, and it was published in German. The actual title is in German, but I'm not going to try and pronounce the German, I'm sorry. But this work, it advanced, at least so far as I could tell, it didn't advance any formal criteria or laws or guidelines for identifying chiasmus. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that the issue of criteria was taken up more directly. First, 1973, JOANNA DEWEY published a paper arguing that for a chiastic structure in Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 1 and going through chapter 3, verse 6, using formal linguistic and content criteria. Dewey, however, did not formally explicate her criteria or describe it in detail. So then in 1975, David J. Clark made an effort to tease out the criteria that Dewey used and reflected on their potential for wider application. The criteria that emerged from Clark's discussion actually form more of a typology of parallels that might be used in a chiasm, although he does provide some assessment of what makes stronger or weaker parallels within each type, such as his suggestion that in linguistic parallels, rarer words are more significant than commoner words. Clark felt that no one type taken in isolation is adequate to establish chiastic parallelism, and ultimately, with the use of chiastic criteria as a whole, the impact is cumulative. Then in the 1980s and 90s, there witnessed a bit of a flourishing of chiastic studies, with increasing awareness being turned to questions of method and criteria. In 1981, R. Allen Culpeper suggested revisions on Clark's criteria, eliminating the first two, or eliminating the final two, which were setting and theology parallels, and because they weren't applicable in every instance, and replacing form or structure with conceptual parallels. That same year saw the publication of Chiasmus in Antiquity, an anthology on chiasmus in a variety of literary traditions, edited by John W. Welch, with contributions from some of the giants in the field. In that volume, Wilfred Watson proposed 4 controls for evaluating lengthier examples of chiasmus, and in the preface, David Noel Friedman spoke ever so briefly of the need for chiasmus to satisfy sets of criteria, but ultimately noted a common fund of axioms and assumptions and a single sure-handed methodology are yet to be established. A more detailed but still relatively brief discussion comes in the introduction, where the editor, John W. Welch, noted a most important question arises over what criteria must be met before it becomes reasonable to speak of chiasmus within a given text. Welch suggested, and I quote, "If any aspect of chiastic analysis is to produce rigorous and verifiable results, the inverted parallel orders which create the chiasms upon which that analysis is based must be evidenced in the text itself and not imposed upon the text by the Procrustean design or artifice of the reader. Therefore, one's predominant concern is over objectivity. In striving for objectivity, it is reasonable to require significant repetitions to be readily apparent and the overall system to be well balanced. The second half of the system should tend to repeat the first half of the system in a recognizably inverted order. And the juxtaposition of the 2 central sections should be marked and highly accentuated. Longer passages are more defensively chiastic when the same text also contains a fair amount of short chiasmus or other forms of parallelism as well. Key words, echoes, and balancing should be distinct and should serve defined purposes within the structure." Nonetheless, Welch felt that the objective criteria alone do not tell the whole story, and went so far as to say that where the objective criteria are less than perfect, it may still, in certain circumstances, be desirable to draw attention to ways in which the text tends toward inverted order, or to focus in a particular balance, on a particular sense of balance or symmetry, which seems foundational to the text itself. In Welch's view, chiasmus is a literary art form. And like any artistic expression, the ultimate merits of any given chiasm will remain imprecise and subjective. By the end of the 80s, one of the most significant attempts at establishing criteria had been published, and that was Craig Blomberg. who was at the time dismayed that parts of almost every book in Scripture have been outlined chiastically, yet he knew of no study which has mandated detailed criteria which must be met in order for a chiastic criteria which hypotheses of extended chiasmus must meet in order to be credible. So Blomberg advanced a set of 9 criteria which he felt were sufficiently restrictive to prevent one from imagining chiasmus where it was never intended. Unlike the previous efforts of Lund and Clark, Blomberg's criteria did provide some clear measures that could be used in evaluating the merits of chiastic arrangements, and thus marked a significant step forward. Yet Blomberg, consistent with some of Welch's comments earlier, that I quoted earlier, was also careful to note that these 9 criteria are seldom fulfilled in toto, even by well-established chiastic structures. But granted that some exceptions should be permitted, the more of these criteria which a given hypothesis fails to meet, the more skeptical a reception it deserves. Conversely, a hypothesis which fulfills most or all of the 9 stands a strong chance of reflecting the actual structure of the text in question. As the 1990s rolled around, several additional studies in chiasmus and the literary structure of biblical text more broadly were published. Mike Butterworth's Structure and the Book of Zechariah, John Breck's The Shape of Biblical Literature, and Ian Thompson's Chiasmus in the Pauline Letters each made important contributions to chiastic studies. Both Butterworth and Thompson sought to establish more rigorous methods for identifying chiasmus, and Butterworth did so by arguing for a systematic approach which analyzed the text for breaks before making structural considerations, gathering all repetitions and sifting them based on their importance and weighing the conclusions of other scholars. Thompson, on the other hand, attempted to revise and add to Lund's laws, eliminating some of them and adding new ones in their place, and further supplementing them with a list of requirements and constraints which every chiasm must meet. Yet Thompson believed, similar to Welch and Blomberg earlier, that as more confidence is gained in the understanding of the nature of New Testament chiasmus, there may be a case for relaxing some of these constraints, since it is possible to so overemphasize them that a new kind of straitjacket is created. Breck also built on Lund's laws, but went in a considerably different direction. Reducing the 7 laws to only 4, Breck did not seek to create criteria that could be used to identify chiasms with mechanical certainty, but rather sought to infuse chiasmus with even greater meaning. To Breck, chiasmus is a rhetorical helix, a 3-dimensional spiral that progresses with increasing intensity about a central axis or focus of meaning. Thus, when Breck trimmed Lund's laws down to 4 and rewrote what was left so that they would build on one another, culminating in the 4th law, which states that the resultant concentric or spiral parallelism with progressive intensification from the extremities inward produces a helical movement that draws the reader or hearer toward the thematic center. Thus, to Breck, chiastic patterns should produce a helical effect. He really likes that word. That on the one hand produces the forward or focusing movement from line to line and strophe to strophe, and on the other hand provides meaning to the passage by focusing upon its thematic center. John W. Welch also continued to more fully develop his criteria into the 90s, and in 1995 published a set of 15 criteria. Still valuing the artistic aspect of chiastic writing, Welch sought to bring together both the objective and the subjective factors, including beauty and aesthetics, which you can see is the very last of the 15 criteria there. The beauty and aesthetics of an arrangement. Most aesthetic forms, and I'm quoting him here, of literature and art, Welch reasoned, do not lend themselves easily to formulaic definition or complete description, and the chiastic form is no exception. Seeing a need for some flexibility in the analysis, Welch spoke of degrees of chiasticity instead of absolute is or is not a chiasm terms. A text that meets many or most of the 15 criteria would have a high degree of chiasticity, while one which meets few of the criteria would have a low degree of chiasticity. Additional considerations came from those who were skeptical of chiastic analysis, though they may not completely reject the existence of extended chiasms. In 1996, Mark J. Boda produced a list of errors, as he called them, often committed by those proposing chiasms, and David P. Wright expanded on Boda's list of errors in 2004, dubbing violations of them chiasmus fallacies. These errors or fallacies are not criteria per se, but they create a kind of reverse criteria by identifying what chiasmus is not, at least in the views of Boda and Wright. And it seems important to note, however, that like many of those involved in chiastic studies themselves, Wright similarly included the caveat that obviously, he says, these observations cannot be used mechanically to prove or disprove the presence of chiasmus by their absence or presence. They have to be employed as guidelines for consideration in the study of any given passage. So in 1999, David Dorsey published The Literary Structure of the Old Testament, which includes a detailed introductory section laying out step by step how he goes about identifying the structure of a passage. I found it difficult to boil Dorsey's methods down to a simple list of criteria because it's multi-stepped, because he has a multi-step and multi-tiered approach. But the various parts of his approach resonate with many of the criteria that have already been identified. And a year later, Wayne Brower's literary development in the Gospel, in literary development of John 13:17, although advancing no new criteria of his own, nonetheless showed careful attention to method, providing a review of past approaches to criteria, and ultimately adopting, and I would add applying quite successfully, Blomberg's criteria in his own analysis. So by the turn of the millennium, this inattention to criteria that had been noticed basically before the 1980s, this inattention to criteria and method had all but disappeared. At the very least, it was far less common of a problem. Now, a problem of a new kind had emerged: the proliferation of varying sets of criteria. Every new grad student who took up chiasmus in some way in their dissertation would spend time working out some form of criteria. Some of them were more successful, in my opinion, than others. Chapter 2 of Stephen R. Scott's 2010 dissertation, for example, engages in a probability analysis of chiastic structures, which yields 7 proposed criteria. And then in 2016, the doctoral student James Patrick proposed 7 criteria adapted from intertextual studies of Richard Hayes. And there's a certain brilliance to that kind of approach, I thought, because chiasmus, as Patrick argues, is really a type of intratextuality. That is, chiastic patterns are ultimately about internal relationships within the text. And there's Patrick's criteria for you. Further setting Patrick's work apart is his effort to not only establish criteria themselves, but also establish stages of assessment wherein the order in which criteria are applied is laid out. He thus gives higher priority to specific criteria. So that brings us up to 2016, pretty recent here. I just wanted to take some time to really quickly now, after having reviewed all of that literature, identify some of the persistent issues and questions that came to my mind, at least. That doesn't necessarily mean they're good questions, they're just my questions. So, which may need to be addressed at some point in the future, and not the least of which is figuring out exactly what a chiasm is. We need to know something of what it is we're looking for if we're going to be able to evaluate the merits of any criteria proposing to help us find it. I already gave a basic definition at the beginning, but some would consider such a definition, at the very least, inadequate, and there are some good reasons for this. Is really any inverted pattern or any inverted pattern of parallels a chiasm, even if it's accidental or meaningless? If so, then those are certainly not the type of chiasms we're trying to find. We're not going to go through all this effort to identify criteria just to say we can confidently identify a meaningless random pattern. BRECK contends that chiasms, by definition, have meaning. They have a kind of centrifugal force within them, driving the reader to the central elements of a passage. If chiasms, by definition, are structures with a meaning and purpose, then our criteria ought to reflect that, and of course many of them do. Related to questions of meaning are questions of intentionality. And this is usually what the criteria are most specifically aiming at determining. The goal is to identify structures that are deliberate, not accidental. While some authors might sometimes refer to accidental chiasms, I would contend that intentionality should, like meaning, be built into the definition. Chiasms are not random, accidental, inverted patterns, though those may occur. Chiasms are intentional, purposeful structures used by an author deliberately. But some questions may still arise as to what we mean by this. Put in terms of intentional versus accidental, I think most agree that intentional is what we are looking for. But what if we ask about the difference between conscious and subconscious chiasms? Some have suggested that just as native speakers of a language naturally and unconsciously speak within accordance to many complex and orderly rules of syntax, in grammar, so might a scribe immersed in a literary culture which favors chiasmus use it unconsciously. Is such use accidental, or is it deliberate? Musicians and artists similarly create beautiful works of art and music in accordance with already existing rules of order, but the person creating the music or art may not be consciously aware of all those rules. Yet although the rules were followed only subconsciously, no one would assert that the end product was an accident or the result of random chance. But what about with chiasmus? Can we accept subconscious but still deliberate and meaningful chiasms? And that's something that is discussed a little bit in the literature. There are some terminological issues as well that could benefit from some careful working out. Are all inverted parallelisms chiasms? Some seem to treat it that way. Are some symmetrical parallels or concentric parallels or any number of alternative terminologies? Are these terms synonymous with chiasm, or are there subtle differences? What about ring forms, which is just another term? Is it the same thing or slightly different? These questions are not always explicitly explored in the literature, but from what I can tell, different authors have different answers to these questions and treat all of these terms in different ways. I also found myself wondering about different uses of chiasmus in different literatures. Is the use of chiasmus in the New Testament the same as the use of chiasmus in the Old? Or what about the broader Greco-Roman or ancient Near Eastern cultures? And if there are differences in how it functions within certain bodies of literature, does that have any impact on how they're identified? What about chiasmus as used beyond the sphere of the biblical world? In the 1980s, for example, Alan Christensen, who works here at BYU, but is out of the country right now, I believe, so couldn't make it, identified chiasmus in Maya texts. And since that time, Gretchen Whalen has stated that chiasmus is the culmination of Maya literary style. How might understanding how chiasmus is used in that and other contexts from outside the biblical world inform these discussions of criteria and identification of chiasmus? This brings up issues of descriptive versus prescriptive criteria, something that comes up in the literature, particularly as criticism of LUND and BRECK and others. Criteria like the laws of LUND and BRECK are seen as describing how chiasmus works and functions, but not necessarily prescribing characteristics or features that can be used to identify when chiasmus is present in the text. And for the most part, I agree that these are valid criticisms, but at the same time, and maybe this is just my lack of literary studies background, making my brain kind of struggle to get around this, but it seems to me that if chiasmus is known to function in a certain way, and a proposed chiasm does not work that way, wouldn't that be evidence that it is not a chiasm at all? Doesn't that then make this descriptive criterion become prescriptive in that case? It would seem to me that anything which accurately describes chiasmus can accurately prescribe chiasmus. But the catch is accurately. And this is where I think it turns into a deeper problem, or it can, at least. In order to identify chiasmus, you have to know what a valid chiasm is. You can only know what a valid chiasm is, however, if you have identified valid examples to study. But you can't identify valid examples to study without knowing what chiasmus is, right? And round it goes. I think you all get the picture. Not that all criteria are bound up in this circular reasoning. In fact, I think we've got some very good criteria that aren't. But there is a certain amount of circularity in the process, and greater awareness in dealing with this issue may be called for going forward. And finally, there's this tension of objective versus subjective judgments in establishing criteria. And we saw this again and again as I quoted from different people. There is without doubt, everyone wants to establish rigorous criteria that can resolve problems in identifying chiasms. But often, some of those criteria themselves involve subjective or interpretive judgments on the part of the readers. And over again, analysts note, as I quoted, that not all criteria need to be met. And the reason for this, this kind of back and forth, oh, we need rigorous criteria, oh, but they don't all need to be met. The reason for this is because the desire for rigorous criteria of identifying chiasmus must be tempered with the reality that artistic expression is rarely confined to the rules outsiders wish to impose on it. How to be sound and rigorous in identifying chiasms whilst allowing ancient authors the flexibility to use the form as they saw fit will no doubt remain a subject of continued discussion, debate going forward. But I don't want to give the impression that that all hope is lost with chiastic studies, because it's not. The discussion, there are obviously a number of challenges, and the discussion shows no signs of stopping. Just earlier this year, Joshua Berman proposed a set of 4 criteria while also challenging the merits of a commonly included criterion by various scholars. But pointing out the many different criteria lists floating around out there overstates the level of disarray and confusion. And I certainly don't intend to imply that there is no merit to chiastic studies. Although I don't think there are any universally agreed on criteria, there are several common threads throughout the various proposals. And although I have not yet completed a systematic study to determine precisely what the most widely agreed on criteria are, I do feel comfortable suggesting that the following 6 criteria are generally agreed on. 1, chiasmus should conform to natural literary boundaries. 2, a climax or turning point should be found at the center. 3, chiasms should display a relatively well-balanced symmetry. The structure should be based on major key words. 5, they should manifest little, if any, extraneous repetition or divergent materials. And 6, the chiastic order should typically not compete with other strong literary forms. Now each of those are my own wording, and so if there's a bunch of people who disagree with it, it's because I'm trying to word things in a way that include what other various scholars have said and how they've worded things variously. But I also may revise this later after I've had a chance to more systematically review the criteria. But assuming, just for the moment at least, that these really are the most widely included criteria, does this represent the very best set of criteria? Well, I don't know about that. But it does represent the ideas that have proven to have staying power. As one set of criteria after another gets critically examined and replaced, these criteria persist over and over again throughout the literature. That suggests to me at least that there is some weight behind each of these criterion. Is this an emerging consensus? I don't know if I'm willing to say that either. For one thing, one or more of these criteria has been challenged in recent years. Like I said, no criterion is universally accepted, but I do think it represents some common ground. While no one scholar may agree with the list in its entirety, every scholar, I imagine, probably agrees with something on this list, and hopefully 2 or 3 or more. As such, identifying the most widely held criteria may at least provide scholars with somewhere to start to move forward. Thank you.
I understand that cards have been distributed and people have been able to write questions on those cards. I don't know where the cards are, but we can get some of those up here. Do you have any?
So this question is, what critics did Jack Welch read or hear in 1967 to understand chiasmus? I will be hearing more about Jack's story later during this conference, but I know I don't remember the name of the lecturer that he saw in 1967, but yeah, you'll be hearing more about that later. Has chiasmus been found in the Doctrine and Covenants? I think some people think they've found it in the Doctrine and Covenants. I think Boyd Edwards, who will be speaking a little later, might have something to say about that. He's done statistical analysis where he's determined that those are not valid examples of chiasmus, in his opinion. Is the length or number of elements ever used as a criteria? Yes, it is quite frequently. Is a chiasmus distinctively of the or uniquely literary convention of the ancient world? And what cultural or historical bounds seem to govern or exemplify this pattern? I don't know that I'd say it's exclusively a pattern of the ancient world. I know some people have identified it in likes of Shakespeare and things like that. And ring forms, which I mentioned, is a study of generally in modern literature of similar patterns. But I do think it's a lot more frequent and common in the ancient world. Given the ongoing reinterpretation, I guess, of criteria, are there LDS scriptural passages identified as chiastic that no longer fit the general consensus of what qualifies as a chiasm? I have not done that, studied that systematically to try and determine, but I can tell you there are a lot of proposed chiasms for LDS scriptural works and a lot of other things that I don't think pass muster, but who am I? I'm just a kid here. So, is 2 Nephi 2:4 a chiasm? Is 1 Nephi 2:4 a chiasm? Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, and I'd have to look at it. Yeah, there's actually a website, chiasmusresources.com or .org, and it's got every chiasm that's been proposed. That doesn't mean they're all good, but every chiasm that's been proposed for the Book of Mormon, if you really want to see that. What is meant by natural literary boundaries? Basically, where the story or passage seems to begin and end. If there's a clear break, that's generally what's meant there. And that can be interpretive. Some people may have different opinions. Why should Mormons be interested in chiasmus? I think because it has been found and identified in some of our scriptural works, particularly the Book of Mormon, and it can be a useful interpretive and exegetical tool. Like I mentioned, it's something that by definition should have meaning, and if it has meaning, it's going to impact the way we read if we can recognize and properly interpret that. Are there some reasons that differ from the reasons that Christians should accept or be interested in chiasmus? I don't necessarily think so. I mean, Christians or people of any other denomination, if you're interested in understanding the text and a text uses chiasmus, you should be interested in understanding chiasmus, regardless of whether you're a Mormon, Jew, Christian, or anything else. Must there be keywords or can concepts be considered? Yeah, there's a lot of discussion of keywords versus concepts and things like that. Conceptual parallels usually are considered weaker by some people, at least. And it's usually something that fits into really broader, larger chiastic structures, and a lot of people I read at least talked about the need to have, if you have a conceptual parallel for two sections, nonetheless have a lot of keyword overlap within those two parallel sections as well. So, all right, thank you.